A warm welcome to all of you from literally all over the world. Coming to join us for this next edition of the series of pre-annual conference dialogues with speakers. Today we have the great fortune to be able to speak with Shane Tedjarati. He's going to introduce to us a few concepts about success or rethinking success, and then we can open the dialogue and the conversation with him. And so it's really a pleasure to have you on board, Shane.
Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to have a dialogue. Given the discussion about rethinking success, a couple of themes that maybe I'll just put out there as teasers. Maybe just in terms of the context of most of my experience, although I've had experience in terms of starting up businesses, smaller businesses, and then getting them to a reasonable size and then selling them to larger companies. Most of my experience, even though I've started smaller companies and I've been in startups, but most of my experience is in the context of large, complex organizations. And most of it is multi-geography and global in nature. A good half of it was largely in Asia, China, Greater China, and Asia during the boom times of Asia from, say, 90 to the year 2000. And the last 10, 15 years of it has been on a global scale. So when we talk about organizational changes, when we talk about vocabulary changes, when we talk about systems changes, when we talk about organizational design, it takes a very different set of considerations and design criteria when we're talking about very large, complex organizations. The second piece is that, at least for the past 15 years, I've been leading an organization which is also a publicly traded organization, and it's an American company, which has a lot of considerations for monthly, quarterly, and annually reporting to Wall Street and the shareholders and the analysts and the benchmarks that are conducted, whether you like it or not. So therefore, a lot of the dimensions of assessment and benchmarks is done through that angle into the organization. And any kind of changes in those organizations are not done by a heroic leader who believes in certain values, but there's multiple different, if you like, stakeholders and powers at play. Having said that, I've been very passionate about the fact that there are certain elements of rethinking success in, say, big organizations, which probably have their origin in an application in smaller organizations. For example, in terms of organizational, let's put this in two categories: organizational success and individual success. Organizational success largely is defined today in the context of large publicly traded organization in a set of parameters that drives, in my view, the leadership team into a direction that is not necessarily conducive to the kind of success that we find in enlightened movements of the past 50, 60 years and in where I draw my inspiration, say the Baha'i writings. Let me be a little specific. Today, majority of the success defined in terms of the organization is creating what we call shareholder return or shareholder value. But the shareholder returns are now largely driven by a set of parameters that is largely defined by growth in revenue growth, a faster operating income growth, and a much healthier free cash flow. Yes, organizations are also increasingly required to have a greater environmental stewardship and so on and so forth. Yes, organizations are looked at as being responsible in certain industries versus others, like defense, like industries that are environmentally polluting or industries that are not environmentally friendly. But by and large, those are on the fringes. And an organization's worth and values are largely defined on how they grow faster than the market, and their through operational efficiency, their growth, their operational income grows faster than their growth. This in itself has not largely changed for a long time. In fact, we thought that after 2008, this will there was a lot of discussion about rethinking organizational success in terms of the impact you have not just on the environment, but the impact you have on the entire economic system. But that has not happened. In fact, I would say we're not only back to the old days, but by and large, organizational success is about revenue, earnings, and cash. You can imagine the downside effect, the knockdown effect of what that means in boardrooms, in management meetings, and right down to working level meetings of people that go around developing products, around marketing and channel development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at from a people perspective, organizational or people success, organizations in the world still look at behaviors and values that are centered around a person in the organization, their contribution to the organization, and their management of their career within the organization. For example, if you look at behaviors and values that most organizations submit to, it is designed to get their leaders and their top, say, 500 leaders in an organization of 100,000, and by proxy, their people under in their chain of command to exhibit a certain behavior that would get them to become fast-moving leaders, because they feel that that's the way these organizations can align them to the market-oriented goals of the organization, that is, grow revenues and earnings and cash. Of course, do it ethically and do it with all of the compliance that is required, but also do it such that I think that the upshot of it is that majority of the large organization end up creating people that are primarily concerned about their own career and their own progress in the company. My observation has been that the unintended consequence of this is that we give rise to organizations that are largely about focusing on financial shareholder value, while trying to do all the environmental and all the good citizenship parts as embellishments to ensure they don't get ostracized. And we give rise to leaders that are largely concerned about their own careers and their own success inside the organization. Let me give you one or two specific things. For example, in terms of behaviors that organizations look at, let's say 8 behaviors, 10 behaviors, 12 behaviors. A large portion of these behaviors is about how that person exhibits a behavior that allows them to build a good career themselves. How many of those behaviors are, for example, about making an impact in their teams, making an impact in the quality of decisions that they make, making an impact to their environment, to their suppliers, to their customers? Very, very few. At best, maybe 1 or 2 behaviors out of 10 or 12 is about teamwork and promoting diversity or promoting unity at work. And And by and large, the language used is also not a language of compassion, love, teamwork, consideration for others. Majority of the language used is the language around parameters that I discussed earlier. This, in turn, comes down to setting goals and assessments that are largely focused on the financial and the matrices that the organization is assessed on. So my view is that in such organizations, especially where there is no one founder anymore whose values permeate within the organization, it takes a tremendous amount of not just courage, but also deliberate, systematic process and systems design in order to embed values and behaviors and metrics that will drive behaviors that does not make an organization, first of all, self-centric, and does not make the organization primarily only financially driven. When we say we're a stakeholder, we take care of our stakeholders, 90% of the stakeholder taking care of stakeholders is really about taking care of your financial shareholders. So I think there's a lot of movements that are talking about being organizations changing these parameters and becoming more stewards of the environment, of doing the right thing for minority groups and so on and so forth. But I believe until we change these fundamental parameters for large organizations, we will not be able to have new vocabulary, new measurements introduced.
Alice Carboni just moved over from Brazil to Europe. He's a global citizen and very here to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for the opportunity. And thank you so much, Shane, for such a inspiring and interesting. So many questions are raised. So first about the process that you mentioned that we need to have in order to embed the values. And you mentioned that only 1 or 2 out of 10 or 12 behaviors are about unity, teamwork, compassion, love. That's something very interesting. And yesterday I was talking with a friend of mine who used to be a CFO, and now she's a mountain guide, and she was certifying herself for this work. And she said that there is no criteria of this type, but one of the people that was in her team certifying was not certified because he was not sharing the food with people. He was cooking his food alone. He was sleeping under the snow by himself. Things that are kind of radically wrong, let's say, for unity. And so my reading of that is that so companies or certification process, for example, are starting to put limits to say, if your empathy is 0, if you're dangerous, then we cut you, but not put it as one of the behaviors to measure regularly, let's say, and to put it as part of the process, because the instructors define this as dangerous, so didn't certify the person. But what about putting emotional intelligence? Like Daniel Goleman, for example, has very clear competencies that could be evaluated on 360. Do you think that will make sense for companies to have these kind of measurements?
Well, let me talk about a set of measurements. You have, on the one axis, you have behaviors, and on the other axis, you have results. It's just simplified. Let's say you have nine blockers, and you say, is your behavior at company standards? Is your behavior below, or is your behavior above? And then is your result at company standards below or above? I can assure you that behaviors, first of all, are much more subjective in their observation. And if the behaviors are egregious, somebody just gets conducts completely egregious behavior, such as abusive behaviors in meetings, or or does something that breaks the law and all that, it's pretty clear. If you have egregious behaviors, and more and more organizations take action on those egregious behaviors, it's out. We're not talking about that. Most people at work are not jerks. Most people at work don't exhibit egregious behavior or sexual harassment or bribing and stuff like that. The compliance part of it is pretty well the companies are realizing. I would say, I wouldn't say all companies realize. We still have many surprises that come out that companies, big organizations, and I don't want to name any names, have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for egregious behaviors and for breaking the law and so on and so forth. But by and large, there is an understanding that there is a line. If you're breaking law, breaking common code, breaking acceptable behavior, that doesn't matter what your result is. But I think majority of people are above that law, that line. When it comes for people above that line, what really differentiates most people is actually your results. If you're above that line and you have financial results that basically, essentially, let's say for high-level managers, is your your growth, earnings, and cash, which is basically what determines a stock value. Pretty well, that the above the egregious line becomes a gray line for behavior, and that's where the problem starts, in my view, because we are so we have a lens that makes us actually blind to anything that is not egregious anymore. So if you are doing that, and in your contribution to the organization, for example, you don't make other people better. One of our behaviors in the past, in our previous regime in our company, was makes people better. It was very simple behavior, but it's measurable, and it's also, you could do 360 feedback to find that behavior. If you overachieve all of your financial goals and you get a 0 in that, you will be a high performer in that organization, unless you say that's one of our towering 5 behaviors for which, if you don't have it, your performance is not considered above standard. And I would then wager to say majority of organizations I've looked at, and I've probably looked at well over 80 global multinational organizations, will not have an override for that behavior over your growth, margins, and cash. That's what I'm talking about.
My second question is very connected to what you just said about the lines. Listening to a podcast about specialist about company success, he said the model was basically you have competence and you have alignment with the values of the company, right? Like, close to what you described. And he said the 4 things you have to do as a CEO is: 1, you have to bring rock stars. 2nd, you have to get rid of the idiots. 3rd, you have to get money, because rock stars need money. And 4th, you have to show them the vision and the big picture and where to go. How does this sound to you? What this expert is saying? How do you?
Also, is very similar to a typical advice that a lot of people give you. You have to get the best people, and then you have to allocate those. And your job is a resource allocation. Allocate those people and the money you have to the best opportunities, and empower them to do the things. Well, or variation that you just mentioned. I think the problem with that is that, again, capital is a coward. If you just measure capital by the return that it will make, the highest return that it could make, which is exactly how the capitalist system is now set up. And if you just say, I'm going to get the best people, I'm going to allocate them to the best opportunities, what will happen? The capital that those people allocate will go to the opportunities that get you the greatest expansion of operating income and margins and cash. There's no question about that. Unless you come back and say, no, I'm going to get the best people. I'm going to have a filtering process in the middle to say, we would then also agree on these set of behaviors on how us as good people will engage in order to be able to create a greater impact on our society, on our environment, on our people, on our shareholders. And we'll hold ourselves equally in that matrix, equally responsible to it. And then we would start allocating according to those criteria, allocating resources to opportunities. Then if you don't have that middle process, you will certainly, and that you call it values, corporate vision, a behaviors filter. And in a large organization, it's extremely difficult because first of all, it's not part of the vernacular of the organization. Secondly, organizations largely grapple with, how do I make sure that this is not taken as some sort of a soft, wishy-washy kind of spirit to Wall Street and get punished for it?
Shane, it was very interesting to make the distinction between, we do have values, and yet when it comes to the three criteria, we will evaluate those values actually in relation to those criteria. Based on that distinction that you just made, I would like to know how we should understand this last report of McKinsey that came out. The title is The ESG Premium, New Perspectives on Value and Performance. The title says, in a new survey, executives and investment professionals largely agree that environmental, social, and governance programs create short and long-term value. And then interesting that it relates within the text that a majority of surveyed executives and investment professionals, 57%, agree that ESG programs create shareholder value. Do you understand that here by shareholder value, they are again referring to those financial criteria that you referred to, or there is something else happening that is changing somehow?
Well, I'm going to, obviously, I hope that anything I say, you take it as my own personal views and not the public corporation that I represent. I'm not referring to what we do as a corporation or what specific corporations do, but generally my observations, because I've been in this circle for a long time. My view is that the conviction that true shareholder value is created from ESG is still not there. The response, I fully understand. Davos is a good example of the discussions on ESG at Davos, and many companies that are out there talking about becoming carbon neutral in this decade or in the next 2 decades, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But by and large, right now, there are a few forces that are forcing companies in that direction. One is the millennials. And the fact that they're very cynical, they are very, very non-trusting of the older generation who's messed up just about everything in their mind for them. The environment, the governance, the corruption, the divide between the rich and the poor, and so on and so forth. And to be more contemporary, to be able to attract the millennials, they have the companies realize that they need to be ESG needs to be a greater part of how they portray themselves. Number 2 is that there are many funds out there that, because of being politically correct, are now beginning to say, we don't, in order for me to be a shareholder in your company, you have to adhere to certain ESG parameters. What people listen to most is really those kinds of shareholder value. Is my shareholder going to hold me back from buying my stock, holding my stock, and continuing to invest in me because I am doing something that they don't see as ESG kosher, if you like, as opposed to saying, if I comply with these, or if I subscribe to certain values, it actually creates greater shareholder value for the community. That conversation, I don't think is there by and large. And I don't think 57% of all companies, or whatever that number is constantly discussing today, how do I embrace greater value so that I can create greater value for my shareholders? I don't think that conversation is there.
I find your picture of the present corporate thinking very depressing because it shows how trapped
welcome to the club.
How trapped everybody is in the system. I mean, Eric Beinhocker, in his book Origin of Wealth, already pointed out how many big companies like Westinghouse and so on, disappeared because they were so focused on short-term shareholder value and immediate success, they forgot to innovate for the changes that were coming. And I just saw a report a day or two ago, I think it was in The Guardian, saying that today, because things are changing so quickly in terms of new consumer demands, in terms of the requirements for the climate change and so on, that most big companies today won't survive more than 5 years. That because they're so trapped within their present framework that as the requirements of the society change and as demand changes, they'll be left behind because won't be able to innovate in time to keep up with the changes. And of course, Abdul Baha himself, said that there would no longer be trusts in the future, and trusts in 1912 were large companies in monopoly position. So even within the Baha'i perspective, there seems to be might say a serious threat towards the large corporate framework that has been so successful in the short term today. But at the same time, it's being corroded by accumulating debt. I saw a report a couple of weeks ago saying they thought the next financial crisis would come from Amazon and Apple and the big companies, because most of their so-called wealth is in tax-free havens and shady kinds of investments and so on that are extremely vulnerable, and they might in fact be the ones who would trigger the next financial collapse. So there are a whole series of elements that say the whole system to be teetering on the edge and doesn't seem to have a very prominent future. What is your reaction to some of those ideas?
Well, first of all, welcome to the club. I work for a large corporation, and I have very serious concerns about the issues you just mentioned. Most people look at large corporations in terms of, okay, the Amazons and the Facebooks of this world are obvious. But look, in the Fortune 100, majority of Fortune 100 have a GDP bigger than most Southeast Asian countries. And I could assure you, with a reach and influence larger than Vietnam in the world. And I'm just picking out one country because I know the GDP off the top of my head. But also, large corporations not only have tremendous amount of influence, but also in this country have a mechanism in their hands that is called corporate lobbying. Yes. And it's the strangest thing because, and I'll give you that, and I'll give you the other side of the corporate lobbying so that you'll see. Corporate lobbying is a very, very legal way for corporations to go on and lobby. And of course, through the filter of ESGs, corporations are largely saying, well, I am not lobbying for my one product. I'm lobbying for a cause. I am lobbying for lower particulate emissions in the environment. And hence, I will go and give money to senators and representatives who will go and put fuel emissions standards. And by the way, I happen to have also invented a molecule that does, or equipment that actually burns fuels better, faster, and I'll get an IP for 15 years, and I'll do very well financially. But majority of corporate lobbying really is about, again, moving companies to get to the end, which is companies only survive if they can grow. And this growth idea is only 120-year-old idea. Businesses, economies, societies did not always grow 5-7% a year. if they did from 1,000 years ago, you can imagine what the world would have been.
Yeah, their optimal size is not endless growth.
Exactly. Businesses you used to have societies that basically lived on a flat environment, and they grew moderately based on the needs of the society. But right now, you have to grow. Typically, you have to grow 2x GDP, or greater than your end market, or greater than your competition, and you have to grow your income faster than your growth rate. All the corporate lobbying basically moves in that direction. Now, would large corporations exist over a long term? I think we're coming to an era where that is very seriously being questioned by the world, especially the new millennials and the more conscious group of society, and especially those in the we haven't talked about the gap between the rich and the poor, the divide, the CEO compensation or the top management compensation compared to the majority, which has created the 99%, the 1%, or now 0.1% versus the rest. I think large corporations have given rise to a lot of these ills: environmental ills, social irresponsibility, as well as the divide between the rich and the poor. Not just governments giving these, I think largely large corporations have been responsible for that. And I think in that vein, in an environment, in a world which would be more aligned with the high view of the world in terms of definition of prosperity, those kinds of large corporations would not exist. And if they did, they would have to create significant amount of new assessments and checks and balances for them not to be able to do what they're doing to the world today.
When I'm like Arthur, when I hear your discussions, I have, to be honest with you, I sometimes feel that in the world that we're living in today, there are different realities. They're like parallel realities. On one side, if we talk about the scientific literature, or we talk about some of the issues, wealth and poverty, we might hear about practices in business today that would be described to many, I think, in the Baha'i faith as disintegrating aspects in our current society. The short-term time frame, the looking at CEO incomes, that has changed so drastically in the last 30 or 40 years, share buybacks that are taking place around the world today, advertising practices, promoting the consumer culture, who knows, the AI threat that seems to be on the horizon that's being discussed, climate change, of course, the activism of the youth. There's so many different things going on. Like there's a whole group that has a reality that's saying that a paradigm shift is going to be necessary to even survive into the next 20 years even. And so my question really is, where, we need to be talking about integrating behaviors or even surviving a disintegrating, situation. And so when we rethink success, don't you think we have to consider the magnitude of the change that's going to be required? A few little changes here and there is not going to really result in the kinds of changes that are going to save the planet, according to most scientists. Any kind of change that's going to be put into place today is going to be really difficult to impact.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you, Gary. I think that many of the changes that are being suggested or being practiced, let's put it this way, are all in the forms of little changes. And I don't think even the accumulation of all these little changes will create the big change. We have yet to break the jinx of earnings and cash and ROIC. The foundation before that is actually, I think there is a very and I have only given this cursory thought, but I've given it a lot of cursory thought, if you like. We need to actually fundamentally change accounting rules. And it's one of the most sacred, untouchable things in today's corporate world. For example, most corporations, all of the resources they use from the planet has a zero accounting value, book value on their books. What they do, the process of using that resource has a book value. For example, you extract oil or you extract a certain thing. The process of it and what it costs you to extract that thing has a certain book value and sits on your books. But nobody has gone in and said, this planet Earth has certain finite resources. And you both as a taker and a contributor to the destruction of those resources should record those on your books, do your accounting thus. I would venture to say that majority of the corporations would be insolvent if that was the case. So accounting rules have to fundamentally change. How we account for resources in the world has to change, and then also the rules for how a corporation actually creates value have to change. I think if those fundamental things don't change, does not really matter if other smaller measures, as noble and as nice as they are. So in the discussion about impact investing, I think that those have to be. But people think about impact investing in terms of what you actually invest in, but how you're actually accounted for your investments is one of the most fundamental things that have to change.
Gene Parker, amongst other things, producer of a fantastic ebbf podcast.
Have really appreciated the talk so far. This makes a lot of sense to me. The companies obsessed with themselves and growth for the sake of growth and all of that. One thing I want to bring up, and then I have a question that I hope will move us into the measuring success piece of this. I notice that when companies become obsessed with IPOs, becoming publicly traded companies, that their relationship with their customers also deteriorates. This idea of teamwork and contributing to the team of the company, but also contributing to the team of society is really of concern to me. How can companies stop being obsessed with themselves and return to obsession with the customers, which, by the way, played a large part in putting them there in the first place? Is it possible for a company that is operating in this way to coexist with the kind of values that we're talking about? And if so, how do we measure success? How do we know if a company is successful aside from its financial bottom line?
I think quite valid. There's a lot of movements in that area, but I think it will come down to, at least one element of it would come down to demanding that the CEO and the top management of the corporation, which say in a company of 100,000, it will come down to about 200 people. Their measurements be transparently displayed and shown to have an equal measure of these other areas that some of which we mentioned, is environmental stewardship, the ESG areas, plus also things like customer success. How many CEOs, I don't want to name company names, but companies that come to my mind that you all know, they're not, by the way, it's not one of the FANG stocks that you all know, you all use all the time, whose CEOs are ousted for huge negligence, but also given a huge golden parachute for being ousted, but would have never been ousted for customer dissatisfaction unless that customer dissatisfaction or distancing ended up showing itself shareholder price. But that there's usually a lag of 3 to 5 years in large corporations when that happens. So the management is rarely ever motivated or punished for those areas. I think shareholders have to demand that the top echelon of management is measured transparently, not by just increasing stock price, but by doing it along these dimensions, some of which end up being even customer value. Let me also make one mention. There are companies out there, say in the past 10, 15 years that have been created, most digital companies, that give a particular lofty vision. Our goal is to connect every human soul on earth and giving them the empowerment of X, Y, and Z. And they do that. But then their revenues ended up being 99.5% from AI-powered advertising. That has nothing to do with that goal. They're never checked today. Their existence is because they were able to get people to come into this vision of being connected, but then their value that their management creates today and the top 200 who become fabulously rich is largely driven by exploiting that population and driving an AI engine that gives bespoke advertising to those people. Two completely disconnected vision versus action. Nobody checks that. And some of those companies have hundreds of millions of end users. Unless we demand that what companies say and what companies do are measurable and transparent, that won't happen.
It's been a very invigorating discussion and listening into you all. Thank you very much for your time. My question, how does one become part of that change more actively and in a way that amplifies your impact when you are at, say, the director level, the senior manager, vice president level in a company that may not perhaps have such a fertile soil for these ideas or these leanings to grow?
Obviously, a very, very important and crucial question, because majority of us, whether Baha'is or people who espouse to, to subscribe to these values, work in corporations that we were not founders of, or we're not, or maybe public corporations, and we are in this conundrum. How do we actually create impact within the corporation? And I would have to say it's quite complex and complicated, because we have to agree that if, depending on your level of influence in the organization or in the world, if your influence is at a very, very high level, you may have a bit more influence. But because, again, the corporations are driven through those narrow definitions of what value is, I think overall impact would still have certain limits. But having said that, I think directors, managers, directors, vice presidents of products or organizations can really do this by a few big levers. One is having a bigger say on your HR organization, on how we attract, select, recruit, measure, give feedback to employees. That when in our own units, in our own environments, when we say behaviors matter, we don't only then at the end of the day, give bonuses and raise and good reviews on just financial results, and be very clear about how we measure those things and what we mean by it, and actually live by it. In my experience is that if you are consistent, if you over communicate that intent, if you are fair, and if you have created systems in order to be able to get input, for example, on behaviors such as makes people better, if you have created 360 mandatory 360 tools that actually measure that over the long term, and at least you practice it more than 3 years going, that actually people appreciate that, especially the new generation of people. That over time, people appreciate that the organization you're creating is more humane, it's a better place to work, there's less friction in the organization, there's less cutthroat in the organization. It's more fair. There's more collegiality, teamwork, and humanity in the organization. These are all soft things, but I believe that if you actually enable it in your organization over time, over a 3 to 5 year period of consistently doing it, you can actually make a big impact. Can you change Wall Street's behavior with that? Absolutely not. Can you create little ponds of lanterns of light within an organization? Yes. Would you get to a point where you might be so frustrated that that you really cannot change the whole system, and you throw your hands up and say, well, I got to go to another organization, smaller or other, and do something else with my life? It's possible too, because fundamental change, I don't think, is possible to the system, but creating these ponds of light within organizations is very possible, and in fact, I think is highly impactful. I've seen that in an organization of 140,000 people, where a good 50,000 of them are run in a different spirit than, say, the rest. Because over a 10-year period, this has been the consistent mojo of this other part of the organization.
Trust is that one currency that will be the currency for change and for direction in moving into the future, as we can't rely on anything else. I mean, we've seen many challenges to trust and the financial crisis and other situations. I'm working for a big German conglomerate in the automotive space, and we've seen a lot of challenges to the industry now with the diesel conversations. And so, just building on what you just said, becoming an agent of change, how and are there any experiences or advice you would give in regards to change your own organization, and how to create an environment where trust can be developed and flourish, and also enrich the conversation that you're in, regardless if you're with your superiors or with your employees?
Yeah, I absolutely think, Habib, you can. I think it really starts with the people part of it. I think having an HR partner that is 100% aligned with those values and is fully hand in glove with you is a first must. I've always, every time I've gone into an organization, when I started, I haven't talked about the journey I've had 15 years ago at Honeywell, the very first person that I had to let go from the organization was HR. And the very first call I made to a recruiter was to find an HR person. And these were my criteria. And fundamentally, the reason for it is that the HR person that I had did not exhibit some of these values. But so HR, and secondly, debating with your team intensely about what are these values, which are the 3 to 5 killer values that we really, really want to espouse and measure and inculcate within the organization, and not letting go by just and making sure that you're not lecturing your people, that you are conducting a healthy debate and consultation until people are fully bought into those 3 to 5, I call them killer values. That means if you don't have them, your organization is killed. Those key values that you will actually measure. Then we opted for doing something which is a little bit maybe unorthodox, and that is we do business reviews regularly. We have your monthly, weekly sales calls, monthly calls. You do quarterly book closing and annual reviews, all of that. And we said, look, that happens 3 times a year, not once, not twice, 3 times a year. We do deep dive on behavioral values. We have HR days, what we call them MRR, Management Resource Reviews, 3 times a day. And for those reviews, we require everyone to be present, no dial-ins. We don't ask the HR person to give an HR review. We ask the business leader of that unit to give the HR review. And they are to go and talk about their organization and their people on how they are moving the organization in exhibiting those 3 to 5 core values. Running the first few is painful because large organizations don't have that vocabulary, don't know how to report on it, and don't feel comfortable, doing it in the beginning. But I can tell you, it made a huge difference. We've been doing it now for, say, 13, 14 years. The first 3 years of it was hard. It's a whole day, and we only talk about organizational values. And there's more to it, that how we run those days. 2 of those days are more similar. One of them is very different because it's action-oriented. So yes, there are ways you could do it, but it, to me, is to accentuate it, pull it out of your regular, ordinary business reviews. Don't just give the HR guy 20 minutes in a 4-hour business review to give you just certain metrics and off you go. Then you can actually begin to make a difference in that. Obviously, I haven't touched on it. You have to make sure that that also permeates itself into the briefs you give to the recruiters, into your attraction, selection, recruitment, development, and retention policies.
If you have a chance, give me a few items in the list that you can say it's a value that, list the values that improve the behavior of people in the company as well as society as a whole.
Some examples of values. I like them to be simple. I think simple values. And I would say if an organization wants to take the first major steps, and I'm not talking about organizations that are already 8, 9, 10 out of 10 in terms of exhibiting those values. If an organization wants to take certain steps, it will come down to HR, if you like, behaviors and measurements of those behaviors. I would say behaviors that are not centered around you. Think of it as selfless behaviors. So, for example, people talk about development plans or development around the individual. You have to go and become a better communicator. You have to go and become a better salesperson. You have to go and become a better manager, learn how to manage people better. Most of these measurements and development plans and feedbacks and mentoring and all that happens around what an employee does for himself or herself. That conversation needs to change. So if you have certain values or certain behaviors that are actually externally focused on others, they begin, and you really mean it. So I like simple values, like makes people better, like, so that value is actually a very simple value. It's very measurable. It's very, people, you can actually feel it. It's in a 360 feedback is so simple for people to give you a feedback. Do you believe your manager makes you better, makes people better? Values such as teamwork and promoting diversity. Values such as promoting a sense of worth in an organization, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it has to be things that the employee does for others. And I would start with values that are about making their teams and their people better.
To close with a closing phrase, I would love to ask you, what does success look like for you? How would you consider yourself successful because of your values, who you are, and so forth? What would define you as a successful individual?
Well, I think that it would be very selfish to say that I consider, or self-centric to say I consider that any of this is really success in my life. I'm certainly striving to find the right balance in a world that is largely designed around values that are contrary to my core values, to become successful in creating a better world, to create to make a difference in such a world. Perhaps for me at this stage in my life, I feel that despite the fact that I've tried to make organizations and have an impact on organizations and all that, by and large, having lived in large organizations and having tried to do the right thing, I feel that my life has been largely defined by taking. I have been the beneficiary. My feeling is that I would not feel that I'm successful unless I fundamentally make a big change in the direction of my life to become more of more giving. And I don't mean just go and join an NGO and give give back in that way. Giving in a sense that the next stage of my life, if I wanted to contribute to quote unquote success, it would have to be in terms of giving back, in terms of impact that I would have on other people, on society, and etc. I'm a fellow of the Aspen Institute, and one of the takeaways at Aspen Institute is for its leadership program is that it's a journey from success to significance. I leave that with you all because I think success is an overused word, and maybe significance and impact is probably a word that we should leave this conversation with today.